Welcome to this iteration of the South Asian Politics Seminar. It's a special event. We've been looking forward to this for a while. We are doing sort of a book roundtable by an all-star international panel of recent authors on books on India and China. There are lots of points of agreement. There are some points of disagreement between them. And we're going to have them each speak for about 10 minutes or so on their recently released books, and then have a moderated discussion, questions and answers about India-China relations, where they've been, where they're going, India's broader relationship with Asia and the United States. And we're really delighted to have you join us today and this panel. So we are thrilled to have Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who was Foreign Secretary of India, former Ambassador to China, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, who was also in China, National Security Advisor and Foreign Secretary, distinguished career, and Professor Kanti Bajpai at Yale NUS Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Ambassador Gokhale has written the recent book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India. He'll open up, followed by Ambassador Menon, whose book, India and Asian Politics, situates India in its relationship with China, but also other Asian states, and relocates India in Asia's recent history. Kanti Bajpai has written Why India and China Are Not Friends, perhaps the most pessimistic take of the three, and he'll clean up hitter, and probably have some comments also in response to Ambassadors Gokhale and Menon. So please join me in thanking them for joining us from all over the world, two from India, one from Singapore, and the rest of us in the East Coast of the United States. So let's kick off, because we have 2 hours and we have a lot to discuss. So we'll start with Ambassador Gokhale, then go to Ambassador Menon, and then Professor Bajpai. So Ambassador Gokhale, if you'd like to open up about 10 minutes on your book and your view of sort of India-China relations, where they've been, where they're going, the Chinese view, especially given your experience with spending time in China and as Foreign Secretary, I think would be very useful. So thank you very much, and why don't you kick it off?
Thank you, Professor Naran and Professor Vashni. Thank you very much for having me on this program, and I'm delighted to be here in such distinguished company as my former boss, Mr. Menon, and Kanti Prasad Bajpai. My book, The Long Game, How the Chinese Negotiate with India, is not about India-China relations per se. The purpose of my writing the book was essentially to study the interactions that India and China have had over the past 70 years, picking up 6 specific events, and then trying to identify patterns of behavior and to draw some conclusions about their negotiating behavior vis-a-vis us. And I did it as a case study in a sense, in order to make it easy and interesting for ordinary Indians to read, because my own sense is that there are many books on negotiating with China, but most of these are written from the Western perspective and not so much from the perspective of India. The real reason for my starting on this book is sort of based in early Communist Party history. I was struck particularly by the differences in approach between the Chinese Communist Party and the Indian National Congress during their so-called movements, political movements prior to both sides taking power in the late 1940s. And whereas my own sense was that the Indian National Congress essentially was motivated by Mahatma Gandhi's credo of non-violence, as well as the whole idea that we had to negotiate the exit of the British Empire from India. My reading of the early Chinese communist history was that as early as 1927, Mao Zedong was already talking of overthrow of the regime by force, by violent means. And therefore, to me, there was a contrast between the use of force on the Chinese side and the more pacifist approach on the Indian side, which I believe did translate into the diplomatic behavior of both countries when they became governments, when the two political movements actually transformed into governments. The other difference I felt was that whereas there was a genuine commitment on the part of the Indian leadership towards negotiating any problem to find a compromise or a solution, more often than not, the Chinese communists, and in particular Mao, used negotiation essentially as a means of buying time, as a means of temporary reprieve or respite, during which they marshaled their forces until they had enough force to change the balance of power. And therefore, my second sort of conclusion when I did the book was that we approached negotiations very differently. The Indian side genuinely believed that negotiation would lead to an outcome. The Chinese side probably less so. Therefore, in the initial period, the first two chapters really deal with the initial period. You found a mismatch in the approach leading to problems in the relationship. But subsequently, as I try to show in the book, we gained in experience, we gained in understanding, and we were able to gauge the Chinese much better. So that even though the relationship was asymmetric in terms of the size of the economy or the size of the military, we were able to hold our own in negotiations, both multilaterally when it came to the 1-2-3 deal between India and the United States. Mr. Menon, of course, was a very leading player in that, and or when it was bilateral, such as on the issue of Sikkim. Now, so far as India-China relations today are concerned, that wasn't the subject of my book, but obviously this whole book of mine does have a bearing on the relationship as we move ahead. My own sense is that the modus vivendi has irretrievably broken down. Perhaps we ought to have seen the signs beginning in 2014, 2013, 14, and 17. But in any case, in 2020, post the Galwan Valley incident, I don't think that there is any significant difference in the range of opinions in India that we need to build a new relationship with China. Now, my own sense again is that the contours of that relationship are not clear. And we first need to determine whether that relationship broke down because the current governments had something to do with it, or whether there is a more systemic problem. My own view, and I have expressed this in another paper I did for Carnegie earlier this year, Carnegie India, is that there was a power differential that emerged in the 2000s when the Chinese economy rapidly pulled away from the Indian economy, going from a ratio of 1:2 to almost 1:5 today, $3 trillion to $15 trillion. There was a concomitant increase in the military spending of China. And therefore, at least my own sense is that the Chinese felt that they were the regionally dominant power and that they didn't need to deal with India on an equal basis. And that this phenomenon really began around the global financial crisis, was perhaps exacerbated by that because the Chinese felt they had come out of it much better than the democracies. And then when the current leadership in China took office in 2012, a number of other facilitating sort of the work conference on diplomatic work, the conference on peripheral diplomacy and so on, added to the sense that the real competitor for China was the United States. Briefly, my sense is that today, although we approach China from a bilateral perspective, the Chinese approach India from the perspectives of Sino-US relations. And they judge India by whether we've been able to help or hinder China's rise as a dominant power. Therefore, I believe that unless we can reconcile these dissonances in perception, there is not likely to be progress towards a new modus vivendi. And we may therefore see several years of tension, of heightened tension. And many of us, and Mr. Menon has first spoken of this, and I think there's a general consensus that we have moved from a peaceful coexistence to a state of armed coexistence. So I think that really, to my mind, is the way I would characterize India-China relations today. And going forward, I think we are going to see a difficult decade before we reach a new equation. Perhaps I'll stop there, Professor Naran.
Thanks, Ambassador Gokhale. That was great. Ambassador Menon?
Thank you, Vipin. Actually, I agree with much of what Vijay has said, but let me just talk a bit about my book, and because my book is broader than just India-China relations. It's India and Asian geopolitics, the past, present, and it's really since independence. So it falls into two parts. One, the beginning, the past, is really a sort of narrative account of how India has interacted with Asian geopolitics. And the second half of the book is much more about where we are today as a result of globalization, the rise of China, the shifts in the balance of power that we've seen as a consequence of that. And the book makes the broader case, a broader case for India's engagement with the rest of Asia and staying engaged with the rest of Asia. The impeccable timing, of course, just when we walked out of the RCEP, and we, China, the US, everybody seems to be much more self-reliant, inward-looking in the way we're going about things. But that's the broader case. But of course, you can't talk about Asian geopolitics without talking about China, and India-China relations are a big part of the book. I think the book concludes that, we didn't do very well in the 50s, but at least we showed some ability to learn. We then arrived at this modus vivendi, which we worked out in the 80s, as Vijay pointed out, which kept the peace, or at least kept the border where it was for 2 decades and a bit, until I would say from about 2008 onwards, when China started testing the situation. And I think really 2008 in many ways, whether it's a global financial crisis, whether it's a sense that China had now grown fast enough to create a power differential with her neighbors, I think many of the policies that we now attribute to the Xi Jinping regime actually really started under the later Hu Jintao, whether it's South China Sea, whether it's pressure on Taiwan, etc. So where do I think we are with India-China relations now? I'll just take off from where Vijay left it. My own sense is, yes, we are now in a sort of hot peace rather than in peaceful coexistence. The modus vivendi is gone. We're in the process of a reset of the relationship. But this is not, today at least, it's not being managed yet by both sides. It's not really the traditional here, let's sit down, have a strategic dialogue, let's sort out what our interests are and see where it goes. I don't think we've even got to that yet. So this armed coexistence that we're in today, we have a live border, whether we like it or not. And frankly, both sides have made accommodation or arriving at a new modus vivendi, or well, basically there has to be some sort of climb down, much more difficult. China by framing the issue in terms of sovereignty, India by being parsimonious with the truth, with its own people, and minimizing what occurred in 2020. And the real problem for me, the fundamental problem here on the border at least, is that India has no choice but some form of localized offensive defense. You cannot hold every inch of territory all along the entire line by guaranteeing superiority at every point. The choice of where incidents will occur is with the attacker, and it's China which is changing the status quo. The answer, therefore, is to do what we did in 2013, what was done in August, September 2020 in the Kailash range, And that actually makes it much more volatile than it need be. And to the extent that China chooses her tactics or operates on her understanding of the relative balance of power, the situation on the border will take time to play itself out or be resolved. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize this, despite the border situation, frigid political relations, India-China trade set records in the first 9 months of 2021. In 2020, China became our biggest trading partner again, overtook the US. And this year, trade is all set to cross $100 billion for the first time. And here again, we are now entered in a process of India trying to cut economic dependencies on China, trying to build resilient supply chains, etc., with other partners. But that also is not something that can happen overnight. It will take time. In effect, Chinese actions on the border have effectively reinforced the trend towards an inward-looking, protectionist economic approach. That self-reliance, or Atmanirbharta, as we call it, could lead to. The signs are not good. India walked out of the RCEP, as I said. Longer term, well, of course, the Chinese actions have also re-emphasized the value to India of the US connection and strengthened India's strategic alignment with the US. Short of a mutual defense commitment, the India-US partnership today displays many of the characteristics of an alliance: interoperability of forces, intelligence sharing, cooperation, building Indian capabilities, and so on. And to my mind, India-US congruence is actually growing in maritime security, in counterterrorism, even more so after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, cybersecurity, other security areas. India will also, I'm almost sure, continue the external balancing with other neighbors of China who share some of India's concerns: Japan, Vietnam, Australia, Indonesia, Singapore, both bilaterally and in organizations like the Quad. In fact, the AUKUS could actually help to restore the military balance somewhat in the Indo-Pacific and in the seas near China. But at the same time, India also has a China challenge not just at sea, where the US and others share India's interests, but also on land, where the border is, where the congruence of interests is maybe not quite as great. I don't think we can solve border incidents and the boundary problem in the maritime domain. Instead, I think for that, we also need to work with Iran, Russia, Turkey, other continental Asian powers, if we are to see a favorable balance on the Eurasian continent. And this is where, frankly, the US needs to make choices between pushing Russia and Iran into open Chinese arms or creating alternate outcomes, which I think are possible. But I think that window is really closing unless we do something about it now. So overall, what I foresee is a much more mixed future for India-China relations, both contention, cooperation, but with the balance shifted since 2020 towards a more antagonistic political relationship. And it's hard today to discern either the will or the capacity on either side to roll back this ongoing sort of reset, and the direction in which it's heading. Both governments are, however, careful in their rhetoric, and I think we should note this. Neither is signaling a desire to escalate, because frankly, the gains from escalation are very hard to see for either side. And I sometimes even am tempted to the thought that maybe they're satisfied with this new normal. Maybe it serves some domestic needs, etc. That's a thought I'll just leave on the table. There's two big unknowns, of course. One is China's trajectory. In the book, I raise the question without, of course, there's no definitive answer. There are too many questions, actually. Has China peaked? Is she in a hurry because she sees her window of opportunity closing? How will her new internal policy play out, especially her turn towards the left, as it were, internally? Has China moved too soon? But these are, for me, it seems to me that her internal preoccupations are now driving a foreign policy that is probably not optimum judged by traditional foreign policy standards. It's alienated neighbors. It's driving a hyper-nationalist sort of sense of victimhood, of being beleaguered, surrounded by enemies, a sort of Lager mentality, as it were. The other big unknown is, of course, Sino-US relations, which seem to me to be structural, and therefore the rivalry to me seems to be relatively long-lasting, or at least for the foreseeable future. But there are very strong fundamental common interests too. Economic, I mean, both economies are really joined at the hip, and in preventing the rise of third-power challengers and so on. There are other areas as well. So the big issue for me, and this is what I argue in the book, is really what sort of future we can envisage for Asia. I mean, I think there are three likely futures. One, of course, would be centered on one power. I mean, China's offered herself. It has so far been centered on the security structures that the US has put in place. The other would be a much more open, multipolar sort of concert of Asia. But both these, I think, are unlikely. And in the book, I argue that we're more likely to end up sort of late 19th century, early 20th century Europe, which was the product of the last big wave of globalization. And sadly, that ended very badly, where Europe frittered away its power and its global role in 2 world wars. And I hope that we in Asia learn from the past, even though history only rhymes, and that we are better at this game than they were. I'll stop there and let Kanti tell you why India and China will never get together.
Thanks, Ambassador Menon. That was great. Kanti, why don't you tell us why India and China will never be friends?
Yeah, I mean, for a progressive liberal who's optimistic about most things, I ended up writing a fairly brutal book. It had to be done in 3 months, thanks to my publisher. And they really wanted it focused in the wake of Galwan on kind of why things had gone so bad. I mean, I've written elsewhere about all the cooperation, and I do say that there's a very respectable history of that, thanks to Shivshankar Menon, Vijay Gokhale, and many other astute diplomats on both sides. But the book really focuses on 4 reasons why they aren't friends. And there are possibly other reasons. I mean, they don't agree on river waters, on their influence and interests in other regions. Pakistan is a perennial kind of point of difference, and so on and so forth. There are probably things on sort of global public goods issues also where they don't always see eye to eye. But I really wanted to hone in on, for a general reader, on really 4 key areas, just to make it tractable and really give people a sense of maybe what's really most keenly at stake between them. So I have 4 Ps, 4 reasons that they don't see eye to eye and are not friends. The first P is perimeters. And so that, in the book, I begin with perceptions. So let me begin with that, actually. The first P is perceptions. Broad worldviews, historical perceptions of each other, public opinion kinds of views that are available, travel logs and so on, that give us a sense of how the 2 societies or peoples think about each other. And what this chapter shows is that over a very long period of time, until about 1000 of the Christian era, mostly because of Buddhism, China looked up to India as a kind of cultural center. Indeed, there's evidence that they thought of, they used the word Chongguo for India, the Middle Kingdom. Then around the 15th century, some Indian kingdoms look up to China. This is the time of Admiral Cheng He and so on. Kingdoms in Bengal and the Malabar give tribute to the Chinese court. With the European colonial period, the 2 kind of drift away from each other. And so they enter a period of basically not much contact. But by the 19th century, Chinese intellectuals are looking at India in a very negative way, essentially worrying about China and asking why did India, this very big country and once vibrant civilization, get entrapped into colonial rule and seemingly be unable to break out of it. And their answer was that India is a kind of chaotic, divided country, unable to fight back. And their broad lesson was never be like India. And I think the chapter is subtitled From Respect to Disdain. And I think there's something in the cultural domain of perceptions and imagery and sort of gestalts of each other and so on, that has gone from relatively positive historically to increasingly negative. And in the modern period, if you look at a lot of the kind of ways that we might test these perceptions, they all tend towards the rather negative. There's a mixture today, you look at social media and so on, of racism, ignorance, kind of periodic just sort of spikes over things like COVID, which are hate-filled and full of misconceptions and misinformation and so on. So the first problem is that there's a very now deep sense of kind of dislike. I mean, I don't say every Indian and Chinese person is a racist and hates the other, but there are many chips on the shoulder. There are nationalistic, extremist nationalistic views. There's racism, there's misunderstanding and ignorance. And so that's the first problem. The second is, of course, perimeters, which is the one that we always come down on. And what's striking here to me is that there've been two cycles of the kind of problem over the border, Tibet, and military stability. And from 1949 to peaking in 62, they went through a cycle of trying to cooperate and succeeding to some extent over the border, over Tibet, and even military stability. And that broke down and they went to war. And then almost immediately after that, they began another cycle of attempted cooperation and did pretty well. And we peaked, as it were, in the Galwan conflict. And in Q&A, we'll probably come to perhaps what are the reasons why they've not been able to get a border settlement when there's been a kind of commonsensical sort of a swap deal that was always on the table. The Chinese would get Aksai Chin, India would more or less get Arunachal Pradesh in the east, and that seemed like a good conclusion to their problem. But it's never happened, despite the Menons, the Gokhales, and many other wonderful diplomats. And I think we can unpack that. But one of the things that's worrying me in looking to the future here is I've been saying, whenever you think India-China problems over the perimeter, think Tibet. And all the signs are that we're going into a period where the Chinese are becoming very sensitive about Tibet, partly because the Dalai Lama now is getting much older, obviously. I hope he lasts a long time. But the transition to the next phase in Tibet of leadership is upon us, and that will force decisions in Beijing and India. And I think in the mix of that, the perimeter issues are going to get worse, not better. The third P is partnership, which is just a fancy way of saying, just to state the alliteration, alliances. If you look at India, the United States, the Soviet Union and Russia, and China, there are 2-3 things that are striking out of that kind of quartet. India has always, despite formal non-alignment, turned to the United States or the Soviet Union or Russia in some respects to balance China, always. And the Chinese have always been in partnership with either the Soviets or the Americans or now the Russians. But our two protagonists, that is India and China, have never been alliance partners. Of the quartet, they're the only two that have never been on the same side, except briefly during World War II, when they fought the Japanese. So the implication of that is that, at the high command level, political high commands, strategic high commands, the militaries, the elites, they have simply never been so deeply interconnected that they built a kind of strategic social capital, a kind of trust and comfort and knowledge of each other that might have got them through very rough periods. As both Mr. Gokhale and Menon pointed out, the deepening partnership of India with the United States, the growing polarization of China with the United States means that this quartet, from the point of view of India-China, the situation couldn't be worse. We're again not with the Chinese. They are antagonistic to the United States, who is our greatest partner at this point. So the prognosis in terms of the partnerships also just looks very bad for the future. The last P is power. This is a story that we probably know, but the chapter unpacks three elements of power: economic power, military power, and soft power. And the broad thesis is the one that Mr. Menon and Mr. Gokhale have gestured towards, which is that from about 1960 or even as late as 1980, from a time of relative parity between India and China, the gap has just grown and grown and grown, most dramatically, obviously, in the economic realm, but also in the military realm. And oddly enough, using a series of measures and kind of impressionistic sort of data, as well as some personal anecdotes and so on, my own sense is that even on soft power, where it's long been touted that India had the advantage, my own sense is that China, as an authoritarian country, in fact, is winning the soft power game precisely because it's authoritarian, because its leadership, in a sense, is seen to be able to do very quick problem solving. There is very competent leadership. It stays for a very long time. It's very far-sighted, and so on and so forth. And, I mean, most countries in the world are actually authoritarian or soft authoritarian. So China is kind of attractive to them, it seems to me, more so than India's noisy democracy. So China may not be more attractive than every other country to many other powers, but when powers look at India and China, I think they're more drawn to China. They're in awe of China at the very least, which is something they don't feel for India. So anyway, I mean, I think the implication of this growing power differential is the following, which is that China now regards itself as so powerful vis-a-vis India that it doesn't see why it should make any kind of concession to India. And India, seeing its weakness, is unable to concede, because any kind of concession would look like strategic surrender, and would possibly encourage China to push even harder for more concessions. So it would be a slippery slope. So I think the power differential is very worrying, because the implication for both is not to make concessions. And so the relationship actually out of the power differential is likely to get worse. So summing up, I mean, I think on the perceptions, the negativities are growing. On the border, to the extent that beyond just the tangle in Galwan, to the extent that things get worse in Tibet, I suspect the border problem will become more severe. Partnerships, they're more polarized than ever on two different sides of the emerging, I think, new Cold War between the United States and China this time. And on power, I mean, the differentials look to grow, and therefore the inability to make mutual concessions is likely to get worse. And with that happy thought, I'll stop.
Thanks, Kanti. That was great. That was three excellent presentations and three must-read books. And although they cover different terrain, no pun intended, I think there are lots of, I think, more agreement than disagreement across the books. And I want to start sort of with Professor Bajpai's, I think, central point, which is the fundamental issue in the India-China relationship is the power asymmetry, and everything sort of flows from that. We've made Kanti a realist, which I think for me is quite an achievement. And so I wonder if Ambassadors Menon and Gokhale agree with that. So last year, the question that we all speculated about was, why did China press on the line of actual control in so many points, in such ferocity, in such numbers? And it led to Galwan, and there was never really a satisfactory answer as to why China did it. There's a lot of speculation, infrastructure, Article 370, Tibet, et cetera, et cetera. I think the question this year, to which I haven't seen a satisfactory answer, is why has China persisted, right? And what is it, both tactically on the line of actual control? All of you have discussed sort of the inability to settle the border dispute. So why has China stayed in numbers and been unwilling to disengage essentially everywhere, despite, except maybe the Pangong So area. And there, as Ambassador Menon mentioned, the Kailash range operation may have been crucial in sort of a tit for tat swap. But there's sort of the tactical issue. But is there a strategic reason as to why China wants to maintain this bargaining chip? And I wonder whether there is a leading explanation that each of you have as to why China persists in putting pressure on the line of actual control. Now, one potential explanation is there's a fait accompli, and it is much more costly to expel China from its consolidated positions now than it is for China to sort of maintain it. So the sort of cost balance shifted towards China. But it sort of is a festering wound in the relationship. Does China not care? Is it trying to keep it as a bargaining chip strategically? It has a tactical advantage. So I wonder sort of what your thoughts are why after, what are we at, 13 rounds of Corps Commander meetings? I thought it might be lucky number 13, but there is no end in sight. There's no evidence that China is being anything but intransigent on disengagement at any of the additional points. And so where do we see this going, and why? More so than the tactical piece of it. What is the sort of rationale you can divine as to why China continues to do this? Ambassador Gokhale, you want to start?
Sure. I don't see any great gain for the Chinese in terms of territory. This creeping aggression that they do, and they've done it in the South China Sea as well, that hasn't brought a great deal of territory in the Indian Union territory of Ladakh. So that can't, to my mind, be the principal consideration for what they've done. I can only presume that there may be a thinking of doing something with India in the same way that Mao tried to do in the early 1960s, which is to create a problem in the border as a political message to India, which would, quote unquote, punish us and keep us puissant for 25 or 30 years. And while that might have succeeded in the 1960s, I, at least for one, believe that perhaps this time the Chinese have made a strategic misjudgment. They're dealing with a very different India, with a very different leadership as well. And I think that we are now seeing a pushback. And in this situation, a climb down from the Chinese is probably problematic. Now, I think this is not the first time we've had this situation. We've had this situation in 1987 and 1988 as well. And it took a few years for them to climb down, but climb down they did because we held our position then. I believe that we can hold our position even now. Of course, they are probably better equipped to create a problem or multiple pressure points on the border now because of the infrastructure building that they have done. But then, of course, they are also facing on the other side a much better prepared Indian army, as well as, shall I say, improved logistics, although not necessarily an ideal situation, but certainly not of the 1962 variety. So in a nutshell, my assessment, Professor Narang, is that their intentions have perhaps not gone the way it should have. I think they've made a strategic mistake. They don't know how to get out of that at the moment because they are finding an India which is hunkering down and saying, I'm sorry, but until you decide to disengage and de-escalate, we aren't moving on the rest of the relationship. They find an India which is matching them in terms of troop deployments on the frontier. And at this stage, a climb down for them will be damaging to the leader in the 100th anniversary of the party and in the run-up to the next party congress. So, I could be wrong, but this is my assessment.
Ambassador Menon?
I agree with Vijay that, they can't climb down now before the 20th Party Congress. Mm-hmm. And I also agree with him, and my feeling is that they didn't achieve everything that they wanted to achieve in 2020. Because I think it was more than just a tactical military, improving the line, straightening the line, or one of these small things. It didn't need this level of what they did actually, because in effect they tore up all the agreements and changed the basis of the relationship. So it had to be a bigger strategic calculus. And there, I think it's the political use of force with several messages. I think the Chinese for the last 3 years have been signaling that they don't think that India is neutral between them and the US. In fact, the line they use is that India is no longer non-aligned, which for them means that India has gone over to the dark side, as it were. So I think it works at several levels for the Chinese. Politically, it worked. But none of these has been fully achieved. One, to signal to India that the US is not going to pull your irons out of the fire on the border. You have to deal with us. And we have superiority here. But I don't think that worked. That it wasn't an unmixed message as it may have been in 1962. I think it was also a message to India's neighbors that if India can't take care of itself, why are you relying on India, particularly to Bhutan after Doklam? I think that was probably a message, but to Nepal, to Sri Lanka, to other neighbors, because suddenly South Asia matters to China. I mean, this is now close. After all, if the central fault line is between China and the US and the center of gravity of politics, economics is here in the Asia Pacific, then South Asia starts mattering much more. It's not a sideshow as it was in the Cold War to the main fault line at the Fulda Gap. Thirdly, I think it was also an attempt, as Vijay says, to shock us into an understanding of the hierarchy that China now sees and how China sees Asia now playing itself out. Frankly, to distract us from our maritime engagements, make us spend whatever little money we have on our land borders. So I think it worked at various levels. But as Vijay said, I don't think all of these were wholly successful because they weren't successful on the ground. So why have they persisted? Why do we still have 100,000 troops from both sides on this line? And why is it all alive? Because they can't afford to be seen to be backing down. And now that they've framed it as a sovereignty issue, and they have a 20th Party Congress, a coronation coming, I think it's going to take time before they, in the meantime, there's, from India's point of view, since we assume that China operates on the relative balance of power, we work at showing that the effective balance on the line is not just what there is between two economies, which are now of different sizes, but the effective balance is what actually the amount of power you can actually bring to bear on the line. And I think that is different. I think Kailash, for instance, what we did at the Kailash range surprised them. I don't think that is, I think they expected to achieve tactical surprise, that they did. They also thought India wouldn't escalate, but they probably thought it wouldn't riposte for fear of an escalation into a larger conflict, but they were wrong. And so I think they had to recalibrate, but this is not the time today to be seen to be backing off. So that's my explanation.
Professor Bajpai, any?
Yeah, I guess I'll sort of pick up on both the previous sets of thoughts and try out an idea, which is, just listening to them, I'm sort of more persuaded by now than I was before, which is that, we've seen the Chinese in the last couple of years. There was Hong Kong. There have been the increasing pressures on Taiwan. There's been a pretty intransigent view on the South China Sea. They've hung tough on, even during this period, on Senkaku Daewoo with the Japanese. And then there's India. These are the live quarrels that they have. And in effect, I think what Beijing is saying to the world, and in particular to the United States, but also Asia, is, we are not afraid now, given our power, to take you all on and to send you a message that the United States has got its limitations, and I think that's a point that both Mr. Gokhale and Mr. Menon made. And I think a common thread is that the Chinese are willing to now push all these different in all these theaters, and part of it is a probe, is to see what will the American reaction be when the Chinese probe on several fronts, and by the way, simultaneously almost. And they may have come away with the conclusion that the United States' ability to push back is limited. And so, I mean, I think that's one way of framing this, that it may not have been driven so much by the particularities of the India-China relationship, although there are certain dynamics there that we could all probe a bit more. But I think there's a larger kind of Chinese strategy here to kind of push and probe and see what the Americans will do, and give a sense to all of Asia that the Chinese, their time has come, and they're under notice.
So I'm going to continue down this thread for a little bit, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. If you have questions, I think maybe put them in the chat, and then we'll I'll sort of ask them to the panelists. But pulling on this thread a little bit more, all three of you have a good understanding, I think, either having served in or spent time in Beijing. What is it that Beijing believes India's greatest source of strength or leverage is against China? What is it that China is sort of concerned about? Is it economic leverage? Is it solely the partnership with the United States? I mean, the United States, provided, at least, it's an open secret that the United States provided intelligence and ISR in the border dispute. But some of the hesitations in how that was operationalized became evident too, in terms of leasing of drones, but then redeploying them because there were concerns about who would be seeing what if there were US contractors. And so from Beijing's perspective, after the last year, where is India's greatest source of leverage with China as far as China is concerned, and how can India bring it to bear? The economic piece of this, as Ambassador Menon pointed out, there was all this discussion, after Galwan about boycotting Chinese goods, and it was the greatest, single largest year in bilateral trade, and it's only going up this year. So it's unclear that makes Beijing shake in its boots. Is it democracy, right? Professor Bajpai said, I think rightly so, that it is not all that clear that China's neighbors prefer the Indian model to the Chinese model politically. And so I'm curious what you think India's greatest strengths are, and whether China would agree with that. And now I won't go in any order. Anybody can feel free to respond to this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I'll just pitch in very quickly. I think that some combination of those are all quite appealing as ideas. I mean, the Indian market might grow in importance for the Chinese over time, when other markets are perhaps closed to China for various reasons. And so, they're not insensitive to the possibilities with the Indians there. I mean, I think Tibet is always an issue for the Chinese. So that's one source of leverage. But I mean, if India uses it very actively and ostensibly, I mean, it could backfire. It could become the source of then, outright war, as it may have in 1962. So, but I think in India, we don't probably still appreciate enough how sensitive they are on Tibet, the Chinese. And it is a kind of lever, and they do fear it. Particularly, as I said earlier, I mean, we're coming to the end of one Dalai Lama. And there will be a transition. The Chinese will appoint their Dalai, and they will expect India to go with that choice. India will find itself in a very difficult situation. So I think that is an issue. That's a leverage, but a flashpoint between the two. And I think, yeah, the relationship with the Americans is a kind of leverage. And I think through this crisis, they've been probing just how much India is going to try and use that lever. And I think we didn't use it beyond a point. So I I think those are all kind of potential levers and points of worry that the Chinese have about India.
I think there's, let me add to what Kanti said, because on Tibet, you know, there have been extended periods in the past when the Chinese thought we were fomenting trouble in Tibet, and we were sure the Chinese were fomenting trouble in Northeast India, for instance, or arming Naxalites and so on, and training them. So even short of war, Tibet has been a contentious factor, and it doesn't necessarily have to lead to a full-fledged war. And so I think there are multiple possibilities there. On the Dalai Lama, you know, I think India will go by what the Tibetan community does, rather than, it's a religious issue, reincarnation, not something that an atheist Communist Party can decide, I think. So it seems to me that the Indian attitude is going to be pretty straightforward. But I think for China, it's going to pose various kinds of issues. But I think one question that, well, today very senior Chinese ask me over and over again, every 3 years, is why does the world object to China's rise, but not to India's rise? To which the honest answer is because we're not threatening. But I mean, that's not an answer I could give. But the fact is, I think it is that ability to work with others. It's not just the India-US connection, but it's what's happened in the last 10 years, say, with Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, Singapore, Australia. You know, this, or earlier in the 50s, I think it was when Joe and I tried this big African tour, tried to create an alternative to NAM, as it were, with Ganifo and so on, and failed. It's this idea that India has the ability to build coalitions and work with others. And it goes down to all kinds of, the other question that every Chinese audience used to ask me, at least, and even now when I go to Peking University, how come Indians are CEOs of American corporations? And why doesn't the glass ceiling apply to Indians? You know, so there is some lingering sort of suspicion that India is a peculiar beast that we don't understand, and it's capable of surprising us in some ways. So for me, I think we need to temper what, yes, there is official disdain, and it will be expressed even more and more as the relationship gets difficult. But I think there is a much more complicated sort of Chinese attitude to India. I mean, young Chinese women are quite happy to be seen, you know, dancing Bollywood dances and so on. And it's not just disdain, and there's more. I think at the political level, what he says is absolutely true between the states and with the Communist Party or the party state. I have a slight difference with Kanti, by the way, on soft power. But that's, I think, a definitional difference. I mean, for me, soft power means the power of attraction and the power of persuasion. And for me, in the last 10 years, China has actually lost both. China has about the same soft power as Greece does. Great ancient civilization, but, you know, not the best example. I think the China model, autocracy, is very attractive to certain leaders, but not necessarily to their people around the world. So if you look at it purely as a state-to-state business, yes, I think Kanti may be right. And that's what they concentrate on, dealing with politicians and states. And that's the way China's diplomacy works. But I would be a little more careful. And I think that's what worries the Chinese about India, that there's more to India than they understand.
Vijay?
If I can pick up from here, Professor Naran, you know, my own view is that, and I pick up from what Mr. Menon said about the disdain. I think the disdain is also, below that disdain is a secret vein of concern about the success of Indian democracy. I think at the end of it all, by any statistics, the Chinese should be extremely confident. They are running ahead of us on GDP, on per capita GDP, on foreign exchange reserves, on exports, and so on. But I think the real concern is that a country which is as big, as diverse, as ethnically, religiously, linguistically complicated as them, poorer than them, if you go by GDP statistics, still elects its people, its leaders every 5 years. And to the extent that Indian democracy succeeds, it becomes difficult to tell generation after generation of Chinese people that there is really no need for them to elect their leaderships. And now, by the way, we also have had only 3 prime ministers in 25 years, which is just the same amount of leaders that China has had in that period. Chiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and Xi Jinping are more or less mirrored almost identically by Vajpai, Dr. Manmohan Singh, and Modi. So even the political instability argument goes out of the window there. We've probably had our most stable period in India's independence history. And I therefore genuinely believe that we, not the United States, is the ideological challenge for the Communist Party. And I think increasingly they would like to see democracy fail in India. So to the extent that we keep democracy alive, vibrant, set an example to the region and the world, I think we do perhaps heighten fears within the Chinese Communist Party that the day will come when their own people, despite prosperity, ask them why they can't vote for their own leader and why they must have it imposed on them.
Vipin, can I come in?
Yeah. Asha.
This is a truly fascinating panel. Thank you all. Delighted to hear these very remarkably well-argued positions as one of the organizers of co-organizers of this. So here is my security and foreign policy is not my area of expertise, as it is of all 4 of you, including Vipin, but I do pay a lot of attention to it as a scholar of comparative politics or domestic politics, generally speaking. Now, can I therefore try present the following question, which tries to connect domestic and the external. I've been reading a lot on China and now teach a lot on China, and both in especially in political economy of development classes, but also generally classes on democracy, etc. And it seems to me, can correct me. Well, let me just state what I have to say first. It seems to me that nothing matches the intensity of domestic Chinese opinion than what happens to Japan and China, as opposed to India and China. That the emotional intensity of East China Seas, how Taiwan, which was also a Japanese colony until 1945, Hong Kong was not. Hong Kong was a British colony. But anyway, the point is that the Japanese-Chinese relationship is, from a domestic politics perspective, of the kind of intensity that India-China relationship domestically cannot produce. Am I right or wrong? Until it can become very intense. Yes, Arunachal, for a scholar of comparative politics, it was really remarkable to read about the dispute over Arunachal only about 15 years ago did I read about it. I did not know that Arunachal could be so connected could cause such a dispute, or could be the right. So one question is about the Japan-China versus India-China, its domestic implications for China, right? That's question number one. Second, I think I may go towards Ambassador Menon on soft power. Soft power is partly India's great the software that emerged after, especially after 1999, but even before. That's one. Second, Bollywood. Yes, we agree. The Bollywood is very important. Third, democracy, indeed. Now, but India's democracy now, whether it's the great annual reviewers of democratic health worldwide, such as the Freedom House, these are widely read assessments. These are literally read by thousands and thousands of people and hundreds of decision makers, right? And now the Freedom Institute in Sweden, it has absolutely phenomenally risen as an annual reviewer of worldwide health of democracy. Our democracy, according to them, is declining. According to scholars of democracy, like me, is declining. And India now satisfies only a minimal definition of democracy, namely, elections still decide who will come to power. Not a more expansive definition of democracy, which would include freedom, civil rights, freedom of expression, freedom of association, the constraints on executive, normally in a democracy imposed by the judiciary, etc. So democracy is declining. Bollywood, it seems the new regime doesn't like what Bollywood does and would like to channel Bollywood's output according to a script written in Delhi, rather than a script written in Bombay, right? So, Ambassador Menon and Ambassador Gokhale and Kanti, this is all the soft power of India, if the current trends continue, will also decline. And it seems to me, to just put it somewhat rhetorically, China, who, if it was worried about democracy as a Indian democracy as a possible source of India's power, should be very happy with Mr. Modi and the current regime's attack on some of the key features of democracy, or except elections. So let me stop here. I can go on. You can see where this is going, this argument. But can you all three of you, and Vipin, who also pays attention to the democratic side of foreign policy or democratic links of foreign policy and security, can all of you comment on what I have said?
Well, I guess I'm sort of in agreement that what's happening in India, in a sense, is is music to Chinese ears, because it's the ultimate compliment to China, which is that under a democratic India, we weren't able to. This is a view that's around in India, that democracy got in the way of economic growth and even grand strategy, coherent grand strategy, and hanging tough on issues. A certain amount of kind of dispensing with democracy is what you need. So that's precisely it. And by the way, I mean, sitting in Southeast Asia, I'm yet to hear a really fulsome kind of praising of Indian democracy in 11 years that I've lived here. So, I think we've got to look at this as Indians, at least. We've got to look at this problem very hard and cold in the eye, which is I'm not sure we ever won the soft power. And Bollywood and so on is not really the issue. The real issue is, what kind of view do they have of your political values and practices, your economy, and so on? Those are the things that really attract. I mean, Bollywood songs and so on are very ephemeral, frankly. So it's that. And when outsiders, now, of course, as I said again, I mean, it may be that the United States beats China on the soft power game, or Britain does, or some other country. But when they look at India-China comparisons, outsiders, I'm not sure that, in fact, I'd like to be proven wrong, but I think most outsiders in Asia, at least, and many parts of the world, are in awe of and admire what the Chinese have accomplished. I would not say that they would say the same thing about India, sadly. And so I would still say that the soft power battle we've got a long way to go to match the Chinese, to be honest.
And on Japan, China versus
no, I don't have any real thoughts on that.
Any thoughts?
But you're right. I mean, you're right that that relationship really excites all kinds of popular and other feelings in China, particularly in the way that it doesn't. You don't get the same kind of negative excitement over India. But some of the work on social media and so on that's been done, Chinese social media, by Simon Shen at Hong Kong University, shows very, very poor kind of images of India amongst the Chinese, from racism to, it's equally bad in India. But that work hasn't been done so rigorously on Indian social media and popular opinions. But on the Chinese side, vis-a-vis India, it's not a good, and it's not really fear of India. There's a fear of Japan in China still.
Yeah.
And that's understandable given the events of the 1930s and into the World War. But there isn't that kind of view of India. There's a looking down at India, you see, that it's a chaotic Luan country that just, of dark-skinned people. I mean, there's naked racism there who just can't get their act together and who are, trying to punch above their weight.
Can I just add to that? I think the whole, Japan, after all, they fought a war with Japan for several years. And the whole Chinese Communist Party's claim to legitimacy is that they fought the war to resist Japan, war of resistance against Japan, as they call it. And they base it, and especially after 1992, when Deng thought that one reason for Tiananmen was because the young people didn't know the history, what the Communist Party had done. And he asked Jiang Zemin to start these patriotic education campaigns. And suddenly they started marking the anniversary of every Japanese, Nanking Massacre, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, all these museums were created across China, and it's officially sponsored. And Japan, therefore, and that was the switch from Mao Zedong. Yes, he spoke of China having been oppressed, but he saw it as the Chinese people's victory to have stood up in 49. His was a heroic story of struggle against feudalism, because for him it was class struggle. Then internal feudalism, external imperialism. Whereas the patriotic education campaign converted it into a story of victimization, of a century of humiliation. And the Japanese, therefore, became the target of it. So there's no way that our record is in any way comparable to what Japan did to China, and right through history. And there's a strong element of, with the Japanese also, I mean, Sun Yat-sen, most of their political vocabulary comes from the Japanese, actually. So there's a sort of love-hate. There was a respect. At the same time, there was also this tremendous hate for what happened. And that's a much more emotional relationship. Frankly, throughout history, India and China lived in separate universes. We were never part of each other's political and security calculus. And so there isn't really that much to draw on, unlike Japan, which was part of the same political system in many ways, whether you call it tributary, whatever you want to call it. But they drew on each other's cultures, and they're much more intimate. I mean, that's a relationship which is much more like our relationship with other subcontinental neighbors, rather than, it's a much more complicated, it's all the problems of intimacy. On soft power, though, I think we're talking about different things. As Kanti is talking about other people's attitude when they look at India, when they look at China. I have no argument there. There's tremendous respect everywhere for what China has achieved. My argument is only that Chinese are quite cynical, by the way, about official portrayals and propaganda and what they see in the media. And they know even the social media is pretty well controlled and it's not really representative of, Chinese are much more complicated, I think. Indians, you can actually analyze social media and get a sense of who's active and who's pushing what. But I'm not so sure that these analyses actually reflect real Chinese attitudes. Even at the worst of times, when our embassy was being besieged in Peking and so on, or during the Cultural Revolution, none of us ever felt a physical sense of danger from ordinary Chinese. You cannot say that about Chinese in India, by the way, after the 62 war. So I am a little, yes, they are racist. They consider, there is a general attitude that Chinese are superior and so on. But I wouldn't take it to the extreme of saying there's complete disdain and nothing else. And if they didn't take India seriously, why do they put so much effort into dealing with it? So much investment in Pakistan, so much investment in actually neutralizing our influence in various places. It's quite amazing how much effort they've put into this. So they will never admit it, because it's the worst thing to do is to admit that an adversary matters or may have some power. But it seems to me you just have to watch what they do. But I want to go back to what Ashutosh was saying. It seems to me also that there are domestic drivers which explain Chinese policy across the board, what Kanti said, whether it's East China Sea, whether it's Taiwan, whether it's South China Sea, being aggressive across all these fronts. Because in foreign policy terms, this is only consolidated a coalition against you among your neighbors. It's only guaranteed pushback by the established powers, by the US. Now even the UK is getting involved in Indo-Pacific security. So frankly, it doesn't make sense unless there are strong domestic compulsions driving this assertive nationalism that we've seen over the last 10 years. And I would therefore go back there to look for the roots of what we are seeing now.
I think both those last 2 points are worth underscoring. Taylor Fravel, my colleague's book, Strong Border, Secure Nation, makes this point that domestic insecurity has often driven Chinese intransigence on border disputes. Yeah. We often understate the domestic drivers of Chinese foreign policy, even though it's sort of a black box, but it's hard not to think that there are some domestic compulsions that are driving this general trend towards aggression and frankly expansion. The other point worth underscoring is there's this narrative, and has been this narrative, and I believe, I also believe this, that the Chinese were imposing costs on India by pushing on the line of actual control, forcing India to LOC the LAC, so to speak, right? And there is tremendous cost on the Indian Army. There's no question that the Indian Army's long-term sort of, forced deployment and readiness posture has to be completely reoriented because of this. And it will come at great human and resource cost to India. But we underestimate what it costs China to do the same. Permanently deploy the amount of infrastructure and heavy artillery pieces and S-400 and aircraft, permanently, essentially, at altitude is not cheap for China. China also that is trying to gear up for a competition with the United States. And all of that suggests that China cares a lot more about India, at the very least developing a bargaining chip with India than it admits to. And we underestimate the costs. The costs are distributed a little differently, obviously, in the Chinese system, but it's not as if this is cheap for China also. I think that's a really important point to underscore, that in their behavior, if not their words, the Chinese are much more concerned about, or at least the amount of real estate in Chinese head that India occupies is much greater than it admits. Maybe that was a poor choice of words in terms of real estate, but anyway.
May I weigh in?
Yeah, Vijay, please. Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Because I think the central point that I made about the concern they have over Indian democracy is a point that I would like to address in the light of what Professor Bajpai said. Firstly, the first point is that perhaps Western ratings agencies and others might look differently at Indian democracy. But China is not about to take serious notice of that, because they also pillory Chinese political systems. So what Sweden or the United States or the United Kingdom think about Indian democracy is not going to influence the Chinese. By the way, we ought not to forget that, before the global financial crisis, Standard & Poor's and Moody's were rating Greece at AAA. So it's not as if Western rating agencies are exactly the ideal ones to go by. Secondly, I think we also need to acknowledge that if the Chinese were really of the view that India was so chaotic and so diverse and so undemocratic that it couldn't get its act together, then surely somebody in Beijing must be thinking about how a government could win a majority twice on its own in a country that is this diverse. Surely this, even India's worst critics agree, is not a staged election. And therefore there must be something at the basis of that country for us to come together in a national election to vote our leaders. So I think we need to distinguish between China's disdain for governmental instability in India, because they think that coalition politics and the making of compromises is not the best way to make policy. But they recognize very well that the political stability, the underlying political stability in India is strong enough to withstand shocks. Now, can we really say that about China? None of us know, because it's a brittle system. It's never been tested. They've never put themselves to the vote. We don't know what is going to happen today, in 3 years, in 10 years, or in 15 years. There's a possibility to crumble like the Soviet Union. India will never crumble like the Soviet Union. And I think underlying all that bravado that the Chinese display is, I am convinced, a fundamental fear that if Indian democracy succeeds, they have a problem. Because they can't justify their argument with the West is that the West also developed under authoritarian or semi-authoritarian models, and that's true. Wilhelm in Germany, Hirohito in Japan, the French, even the Americans and the United Kingdom. It wasn't a democracy under which development took place. India is perhaps the only example where on day one, we not only became a political democracy, we also started developing our country. So the development is entirely under a democratic system. And therefore, we are in a category quite different from that of others. And therefore, I believe we cannot undermine the influence that Indian democracy has in the minds of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm not concerned about what the rest of the world thinks. I'm looking at what the Chinese think.
Vipin, just a point to the democratic theory and political economy literature is very clear that India historically was the first country to launch economic development and or industrialization with universal franchise democracy in place. Elsewhere, it was limited democracy, limited franchise, whether Europe or America. America had full franchise only between 1870 and 1890. And then in 1965, it's finally restored. The Black community was effectively disenfranchised. But in any case, the Gilded Age industrialization after 1870, which generated huge growth in America and made America the richest country in the world by 1905, that was under limited franchise, no women voting, very few people of color voting, and it was basically white male adult franchise. So Mr. Gokhale, Ambassador Gokhale is absolutely right. Scholars agree that India historically was the first country to launch economic development and industrialization at a low level of income with universal franchise democracy in place.
So, well, I would add Japan, but anyway, yeah.
I'm just going
post-war Japan.
I'm going to ask one final question before turning to the audience questions. And that's on the relationship between India and the United States, right? So one of the consequences of Chinese behavior in the last year has been India basically, I think, breaking its hesitations on the Quad and being more openly enthusiastic about cooperating with, what it calls like-minded democracies. And the Quad has been one incarnation of that. The breadth of cooperation on the Quad is nothing to shortchange. I mean, there are a variety of working groups, as all of you know, from vaccines and counterterrorism to intelligence and cyber. I think if there's one criticism of the Quad is that the hesitation on openly naming China as sort of the target of the coalition. And I would say the depth of the security cooperation is still sort of working itself out. I think there are some questions about how far and how willing India may be willing to go with the Quad in terms of, beyond exercises. And one view is that the AUKUS deal, which was a very, very, very clearly deep security cooperation between two Quad partners and then the United Kingdom, in the historic transfer, let's see if it happens, but the historic pledge to transfer nuclear submarine technology, SSN technology, to Australia, something the United States has done only with the United Kingdom. And there are questions, about whether the US would ever do that with India, but given its relationship with the Russian military, probably unlikely. And the US made it clear that AUKUS was sort of an exception. And I think sort of the question where I'm going here is, are there limits on how far India is willing to go in security cooperation, how deep the relationship with the United States can go on the security side? There's no question the breadth of the relationship is at levels it has never been: diaspora, dollars, defense, democracy, right? My 4D sort of description of the relationship. It is deep. The diaspora is a huge part of it. Trade is a big part of it. Defense is a huge part of it, but can it reach levels of sort of U.S.-Australia cooperation, given sort of India's historic, Russian dependence? And there's this issue of CAATSA sanctions looming, and it hasn't been sort of dispensed by the Biden administration yet. It's still sort of, the administration is still waiting for the first delivery of S-400 before taking a call, but it has essentially punted on taking a call and waiving sanctions. And it is not at all clear to me that sanctions will be automatically waived. And I think it should be, because I don't think any of the authors of the CAATSA legislation thought that India should be a target of it. And I think it'll backfire. I mean, I think my views on this are relatively public and out there. It'll just drive India closer into Russian sort of military dependence and empower those who think that a relationship with the United States has pitfalls and speed bumps that are inevitable. So although there's been this increase in cooperation, the critics would argue, okay, the limits of the cooperation are also evident, especially on the one dimension that you would expect it to be deeper after sort of the Chinese provocation, which is on the security side. Is that a fair view? What is your guys' view about the long-term prospects of it? Ambassador Menon is right. There are a lot of pieces of this that look like, an alliance, though no one will call it that. The U.S. doesn't do formal alliances anymore. India really doesn't do formal alliances, but a rose by any other name can smell as sweet. So how do we think about this relationship going forward? And are you surprised that there actually hasn't been sort of even greater impetus than there has been in bolstering the security piece of the cooperation? Anybody, in any order, who wants to take it?
Maybe I can just make a couple of comments.
Sure.
I think really Quad is very much in India's self-interest. It's driven by self-interest. And, Mr. Menon was one of the earliest people who would talk about India going back to its maritime roots, about that for 1800 years, if India was the largest or second largest economy, it wasn't because of the Indo-Gangetic plain, it was because of the coast. So in a sense, if we are going back to that,
of course, say that.
Yeah, so if you're going back to that situation, I think it's in the self-interest. As far as CAATSA is concerned, who are you going to sanction? The same guys who are going to buy American weapons, and we bought $20 billion of them. So, I mean, it's cutting your nose to spite your face. It's as simple as that.
I don't disagree, and I just wonder why it hasn't been taken off the table yet.
Yeah, it should have been just cleaned up earlier, I think. It's quite clear, because to me, it's going to feed everyone in India who says the US is unreliable. B, they tell us what we should be doing. Who are they to tell us what's best for our defense, etc.? It'll start an unnecessary argument. But anyway, but about Quad hesitations, I want to set the record straight. Quad 1.0, Australia and the US walked away.
Correct.
The US,
correct,
before the Obama visit to China. It wasn't India. In fact, India invited Singapore, Australia to actually participate in the exercises in Malabar in 2007. So let's just be clear on the record, because everyone keeps saying India was hesitant. It wasn't. The revival of Quad was Japan and India. And okay, now suddenly Australia, since her relationship with China has gone sour, is very, very keen on Quad and has gone beyond Quad with AUKUS, which I frankly welcome. I think it's a good thing, because it helps to restore the balance that the Chinese buildup has upset. And we need some kind of balance in the Indo-Pacific, in the maritime space. But your question about, are there limits to India's willingness to work with the US in the security field? I think those limits, you can't expect India and the US to have identical interests on every security issue. And it's clear on the continent, on the Eurasian continent. We've been saying for years now that, why are you pushing the Iranians into the Chinese arms? Why are you pushing the Russians into the Chinese arms? And we will look at many of these issues differently. But so that, yes, there will be limits. And because these are two countries on opposite sides of the earth at very different levels of development, very different geographies, very different security needs as well. But the congruence is growing, and we will continue to work together. And for me, actually, there is more and more for us to do together. We don't have to concentrate on the differences and let them drive the relationship and thereby hand agency to other people in our relationship. I mean, I've never understood this logic where we allow the enemies of the relationship to set the terms of our relationship. Why?
Kanti, anything?
No great thoughts on this issue. I'm quite keen to hear some questions from the audience, actually. So I'm just going to pass on this one.
So they've come in the chat. I think we're at a point now, if the participants can ask their own questions, because I think we're okay on that front. Kunal, you want to ask your questions? I've got you first on the list here.
I can't see any other questions in the chat.
They have directly sent them to me. I can ask them, but Kunal, can you?
I can only see one about nuclear weapons.
Oh, I didn't even see that one. That's not me, I promise.
It says, what about nuclear weapons? Do they matter?
That's a big question. No, they don't. Okay, Kunal, can you? Is he able to? There we go. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks Ambassador Menon, Ambassador Gokhale, and Professor Bajpai. This was wonderful. So I had like two quick questions to the diplomats. So both Ambassador Menon and Ambassador Gokhale said that China will find it difficult to climb down from its current position. So as diplomats, do you suggest some face-saving, exit measures, or like could new border agreements, which may be like roughly similar to the old agreements, but can serve as face-saving exit measures? So do you suggest something like that? Second, Ambassador Menon said that India will have to use offensive, defensive military measures. So how long should we wait before deciding to like no other method is now working, and finally the military has to take those offensive, defensive measures? So how long should we wait? Already, I think 13, 14, I have lost the count of military talks.
Addressed to me?
Sure.
Well, thank you for that question. On the first one about face saving, as I said, I don't think China's domestic situation today, at least for the next year, until the Party Congress next year, would permit, a quick climb down from where they are. And also they framed it as a sovereignty issue. As long as the Chinese used to frame the border, the boundary as disputed, then give and take is possible, right? I mean, a dispute is something you settle by both compromising. Sovereignty cannot be compromised. As their law says, their new law on the border, on the boundary actually says sovereignty will never be compromised, not an inch of territory, etc. So there is a problem there in the framing now and in the political timing, I think. But we're not saying they will never climb down. No, I mean, it took something like 7.5 years in the case of Sundarungchu for us to actually arrive at a solution which worked. And in terms of face saving, to just recycle the old agreements, I mean, they didn't work once, they failed. They worked for a while, but they failed in this situation. I don't see much gain in just recycling the old agreements and producing them again. About offensive defense, this is really a tactical issue. This is something that, it's best left to those who do these things. And the military knows best when and where and what. I don't want to sit here and second guess what they do.
Kunal, can I also just weigh in on one point, and that is the use of the word face saving. This is something I've dealt with in my book in some detail. This is a very Chinese phrase of the question of saving face. But I think we need to get over this. Both countries or all countries, when they negotiate with each other, act in self-interest. Therefore, there is no need to save the Chinese face. It's not a matter of saving anybody's face. It's a matter of reaching a common interest or a common solution in a negotiation. And if that happens, it saves the face of both. Without having said this, I think we really need to break away from this whole idea that somehow the rest of the world is responsible in giving face to China. It's about time that India insisted that China gives face to us. So I'm personally dead against even using the word face saving where China is concerned. We should just talk self-interest and both should compromise. And I think we will find a solution. There's no reason why we can't. As Mr. Menon said, it took 7.5 years in the Guangdong crisis, but we did eventually disengage and de-escalate.
Kanti, anything on that?
Yeah, no, I was slightly, I mean, just listening to this and going back to some earlier discussions on the domestic politics angle, one thing that I do, I'm sort of worried about in respect of China is, you know, the extent to which Xi Jinping has gone out and, you know, is trying to face down everyone. And I'm sort of asking myself the question where that's coming from. And this is where the domestic politics may be a factor. I mean, he looks so magisterial and unchallenged and all of that. But I have a sneaking worry that actually he knows something about his own, the brittleness of certain aspects of Chinese life and its policies and the economy and his own party and himself. And it arises, I think, from just an instinct about it that, you know, I mean, there's a kind of social contract that the Communist Party and Xi Jinping have offered the Chinese people, an increasingly educated, urban, and in some respects, liberal people now, of a younger generation particularly. And the contract is they've given up, you know, normal sort of freedoms of a middle-income country to this Communist Party because it promises, you know, great things. And I think what's in the air slightly is, okay, we gave you all this power to run this place, and you've got all this power that you've built up, comprehensive national power, the China dream, you're #1 now, you know, in economic terms, if you go by PPP and all of that. But how come we still can't settle Tibet and pacify those guys? How come the Uyghurs are, you know, poking us in the eye periodically? How come the Taiwanese are still out there, you know, saying that they're not happy to join the main? Now, what about these pesky Indians also? I mean, giving succor to the Dalai Lama and Tibetans and so on, and the South China Sea, a bunch of small Southeast Asian countries who can resist us. I've got a feeling that the pressure is on in a sense, and we're not tracking it, or we're not getting enough evidence for it. But the pressure is, here you are with all this internal and external power, you're not delivering on these fundamental political issues. And I think that's a thing that may be driving quite a bit of some of this. I mean, Xi Jinping is acting strong externally to sort of say, oh yeah, I am doing something about all these things. I'm facing these people down and watch me. But I think there's a worry there. If he doesn't, he's kind of boxed himself in.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Can I? You know, I argue in the book that this is the first time in history that China is powerful but dependent on the world. When you look at it in terms of the external sector as a part of GDP, you look at, she needs the world for energy, she needs the world for food. She's the only large temperate country which cannot feed itself. She needs the world for technology. She needs access to markets. She needs commodities if she's to continue keeping her economy going. And this is she's never been in this situation before. She's been weak and dependent under the Song, which was tremendously creative. But she's never been powerful and dependent. And it sits very badly in the psyche. And I think some of this edginess that we see comes from there. It's also a country which since 2011 has spent more on internal security than it does on national defense, more on the policing than on the army. That tells you something. So for me, what Kanti is saying is true. I think there are other parts of this puzzle which actually explain China's external behavior rather than just a straightforward, you know, IR calculus.
Yeah, see, I think the economic analysis of China since the 1990s, at least one major scholar of that, Yasheng Huang at MIT, has been arguing consistently since his book on FDI in China, that the Chinese communist state is not going to allow domestic entrepreneurs to become the #1 entrepreneurs in the country. To put it very simply, he said, China is not going to allow rampaging domestic billionaires because they are a threat to Communist Party. Imagine Jack Ma, suppose he gets to 100 million, all you need is $1 billion to finance an opposition political party. And if at all they're given that kind of freedom. So before you even talk about what freedoms they might have, clip their wings. And the hierarchy is very clear. He said, and this is a very remarkable point that Yashing Huang has been making, and now it's once again coming true. Namely, foreign state-owned enterprises will be #1 in the hierarchy. Foreign invested enterprises, FIEs, will be #2. And ethnic Chinese enterprises, ECEs, will be #3. And when this balance is disturbed, the communist state will crack the whip, is the argument. That has gone on since late 98, 99 in his work, and is once again coming true. The attack on internet companies is so unbelievable for those who don't pay attention to the political economy of China, right? That how is it that Xi Jinping is going to attack some companies that have produced so much wealth? Well, the problem is Jack Ma cannot, certainly after the speech he gave in August, will be seen, and people like him will be seen by the communist state as a serious potential threat. Their wings must be clipped.
Okay,
that's just the economic component of this. Yeah.
I've got Gautam Nair next, and then Mohit has his hand up. If you have a question and it's not in the chat, you can raise your hand, and we can also run traffic that way. So Gautam, why don't you ask your questions?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much, Professor Narang, for organizing this. This has been a very enlightening and pretty nuanced discussion. I've learned a lot from it. My question was basically about sort of how the speed of China's ascendance affects India's foreign policy stance. Specifically, I mean that I think that if you look at it in every 5-year interval, China's economy has been at a higher point than anybody expected, largely driven by productivity growth and technological advancement. And it seems like that India has essentially adopted a policy of aligning pretty closely with the United States, and that distinguishes it from other countries in Southeast Asia, even in East Asia, where they seem pretty comfortable with China's rise and are increasingly essentially aligning with it, right? So my question is, how does a policy regime look different if China is a preponderant or the most important, the most powerful state in the international system in 10 years rather than 20 years? Is there a difference, or does it essentially look the same? And the second question I had, if you don't mind, was what would it take for you to say when Prime Minister Modi is up for re-election, to say that his foreign policy has been successful enough to merit re-election? What sort of benchmarks would you look to say that on this dimension, on the foreign policy dimension, that his tenure has ultimately been successful?
Who wants to take a crack at those?
Take a crack at the second one. At least my sense is that foreign policy is not the #1, #2, or #3 subject when it comes to the general election in India. The Ministry of External Affairs still remains the smallest ministry in the government of India, barring probably the Ministry of Textiles, which is slightly smaller.
Yeah, but you guys like it that way.
But you as the experts. I'm not saying that you're the electorate, but
Yeah, but what I'm saying is that I don't think foreign policy really gets that many eyeballs in an election unless you have tension with Pakistan, or probably now the situation in East Ladakh with China. I mean, there are plenty of domestic reasons where a re-election might be possible, whether it is water for everybody, or the fintech achievements, or the startups, and so on and so forth. As far as foreign policy is concerned, it is still very much an electorate that is reactive. If there is something bad happening, then the tendency is for political parties to use that in an election. There is no positive agenda in foreign policy as far as I can make out in India. That's my sort of 2 bits words.
And on the first question, that's $1 million question. How will China behave? If she does have primacy, does have dominance, if she's the most powerful country on earth, which, by the way, is not a given, whether in 10 years or 20 years or 5 years or whatever. But if it were so, and you have different answers, some people tell you she'll revert to her historical role, as the top of a tributary system. Some people say Tianxia. Other people seem to assume, IR theorists tend to assume that she'll behave like previous Western hegemons, the US, the Great Britain, which I don't think is true. But nobody knows. I don't think anybody has an answer for that, because you're not dealing with a traditional Chinese government here. You're dealing with a Marxist government, which has a very different worldview from the tradition and has now invented a whole past to justify its present behavior. And it keeps reinventing that past. Mao had one version, Deng had another version, and you now have Xi Jinping's version of victimhood and century of humiliation and of very strong national feeling. So I don't have an answer for you. There's a long way of saying, Gautam, that I don't have an answer for you of how China would behave if she were number one. And I think it's everybody's hedging against that possibility because of the uncertainty, because nobody's quite sure, and nobody wants to hand over their own futures to somebody else.
Yeah, just on that issue of Chinese ascent, one thing seems pretty clear from the Indian side, which is that for civilizational reasons, if for no other, India will not grant Chinese legitimate ascendancy, in the sense that India will become a tributary state. It may be drawn to the great gravitational pull of China, as everyone is economically, but it's another matter to be a tributary, which is a political relationship above all. And so, I think, there's just that kind of civilizational bulwark in India that, going back to the earlier history lesson, we never were really, except for a couple of kingdoms here and there that sent some tribute. And I think India has a sense that, if anything, it's a kind of superior civilization, rightly or wrongly. That's a different matter, but there's a kind of existential sort of cultural bedrock there, I think. So that's one. And the other is that, in the book, I try to show that India's always allied against China. And that's certainly likely to be the case if China continues to rise and the gap with India grows, which it's going to in the next 15 to 20 years. This $12 trillion gap could become 20 trillion in a matter of 10 to 15 years, 20 years. So I don't know where India can go. It has to go into various alliance-like relationships, primarily with the Americans and sympathetic powers. So I think that's very predictable, that if you combine the two, that India will remain in some sort of balancing relationship to China and not a junior partnership with China. It won't bandwagon with China.
Thank you.
I have Mohit and then Apeksha. So let's get both of these questions in, and then we'll let the panel respond.
Thank you, Professor Narang. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So thank you very much for a nicely organized seminar. And taking the point from Professor Bajpai, my question is directly directed to Mr. Menon, so that we don't have confused at the end who is to take. So, Mr. Menon, until now, I have never seen an argument about India trying to forge a relationship with China where it actually considers itself a junior partner. Because as Professor Bajpai says, like our gap is really increasing, and I'm very worried that it is increasing even further. So why not accept that we are a junior partner, as Chinese did with the Americans for a long time, and then, you know, leverage what we have. For example, we have a solution to Chinese Malacca policy. Instead of doing this Malabar activity, why don't we offer them, say, an island in Andaman? Or you know, like this could solve a lot of our problems. Like in a sense, we could ask the Chinese help to get the POK. In a sense, we could ask for a lot of dollars, like $1 trillion or $500 billion for our infrastructure things. Why are we not thinking the out-of-box strategy? Like, why should we always think the Chinese as enemies and not try to, you know, counter this or consider us for a short time as junior partners?
Apeksha, why don't you get your question in, and then
Keshav also is up. Keshav's hand.
Yep, I see Keshav too. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for this really interesting discussion. My question is concerning the link between the international competition and domestic politics. So despite being democracies, we've sort of seen some democratic backsliding in both the US and India, and there's an increasingly strong right-wing movements in both countries, whether it's white nationalism or Hindu nationalism. So in the next 2 to 3 decades, if these movements keep gaining strength in these countries, like how do you see that affecting the ideological component of the struggle with China?
Keshav, why don't you get your last question in, and then we'll open it up to the panel for everyone.
Hi, thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I would like to thank the panelists for such an insightful conversation. So my question is whether, you know, China has used its military might against India and Jammu Kashmir. It's been using its military might against South China Sea to, you know, bully the Asian countries. Recently, it has got into trouble with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. It has been invading the airspace of Taiwan regularly. On economic front, it has been loaning off insane amount of money and in a way buying off countries in Africa under the BRI, or even, you know, loaning to Sri Lanka and all these countries in the region. So would it be correct to call China the modern imperialist, where, you know, it's buying off country, or, you know, taking over the country, whether militarily or with the whether through its economic might? Also, the question I have is, you know, do you think that India has been should have focused more on the McMahon line or the India-China border as much as it has been focusing on Pakistan border, if not more? And do you think that just because India put all of its military might towards protecting its border to Pakistani border, we turned ignorant, or we weren't aware of what is happening in the China border, which led to the war in 1962, or even the skirmishes we have been facing with China over the last few years? Thank you.
Okay, great. So we've got all the questions in the audience and chat, I think, on the table. Why don't we do a lightning round, and each of you maybe close about 2 minutes each, 2-3 minutes each, and then that'll take us to the closing moments. So Vijay, why don't you go first?
Okay, I want to really address the questions posed by the second questioner, which is if there is a sort of, for want of a better word, backsliding of democracy as defined today in India and the United States, whether it will have an impact on China. The answer is no, because you know, it is democracies who between themselves argue as to whether there is any retrogression or backsliding. But here we're talking of an authoritarian regime, a regime which doesn't even have the semblance of democracy, and in fact has become more sort of almost semi-totalitarian over time, in the sense that Xi Jinping is tightening controls even on the relative freedom that was there in business, in academics, in intellectual discourse, and so on. Therefore, I don't think that any internal developments in India or the United States which may bother other democracies will have a fundamental impact on relations between China and these countries. This will still be an ideological debate between democracy or the Washington consensus and the Beijing model. And in that, I think the jury is very much out. At the moment, I do concede that that there are large parts of the international community which think that China is attractive, but I also agree with Mr. Menon that we only have evidence of governments being attractive. We really don't have information, data, or analysis on whether the people in those countries are as taken in with the Chinese model as their leaders or their political elites might be.
Ambassador Menon?
But just to add to what Vijay said, you know, out of the top 7 economies in the world, 6 are democracies of one kind or another, regressing or not. There's only one autocracy in there, so I'm not sure who's more efficient. But why don't we bandwagon with China? Mohit's question. Because each of the elements that you've mentioned has been discussed one way or the other, and the Chinese have rejected it. When we said free and open Indo-Pacific, let's work together on maritime security, rather than saying take over an island in the Andamans, but let's work on maritime security. We all have a common interest in keeping these oceans safe and open for our trade. The Chinese didn't bite. When we tried to settle the boundary, I mean, we've been discussing it for years, and it's not quite true that, you know, we ignored the McMahon Line. In fact, the infrastructure built up on the McMahon Line started in 2004. Chinese were first movers. They had first mover advantage, and we've been playing catch up since. But so it's not really true to say we ignored it. It's been a long time that I think many of us have been arguing now for over 25 years that China is our main strategic challenge, not Pakistan. Pakistan's a distraction in a sense. That's the word I use. Keshav asked about the Chinese use of force and whether it was imperialist or not. Frankly, these are labels. I think if you look at China's use of force, it's very carefully calibrated to achieve political goals. And they try very hard to stay below the level of actually provoking a real conflict, whether it's in the South China Sea, whether it's on the border with India. In each case, they test the limits, they push the envelope, but stay short of provoking a full-fledged conventional war. In all the cases you mentioned, whether Senkakus, whether Taiwan, etc. Even in Taiwan, they're not actually entering territorial airspace. They're going into the ADIZ, which actually extends, you know, into over the mainland. And they veer away from the territorial airspace so far. I mean, this can change. But I think the goal of that is to show the Taiwanese how uncomfortable they can make their lives and how they should come to terms with them. But it stays short of provoking an actual conflict. So I think the Chinese use of force is, I wouldn't say subtle, not at all, but is certainly politically driven rather than, and for them, I think war is the achievement of political goals by the use of military means. And I think that's, you know, that's a fairly realistic sort of attitude. But all in all, I think, and to Apeksha's question, yes, our foreign policies will probably change if the nature of our internal politics changes fundamentally, if we all turn much more extremist, much less democratic. But I think the risk of that happening in a country like India is minimal, because ultimately India is, and my favorite argument is everybody in India is a minority, either by language or religion or region, and we have multiple identities at the same time. And the only way we can feel we have a voice in this country of ours is if we negotiate everything. So I used to tell my Chinese friends, we do in public what you do in private. And we argue about everything, and it's messy, it looks terrible, chaotic, Luan, as Kanti says. But ultimately, that's the only way forward for a country like this. And I think everybody recognizes this. So for me, that's an unlikely prospect. But yes, of course, if our domestic politics change fundamentally like that, yes, our foreign policies will change as well. But bandwagoning with China somehow doesn't seem likely. And the last 70 plus years, to my mind, prove that that's one of the least likely possibilities.
Thanks, Ambassador Menon. I'll make one very quick point. Your remark reminded me about there's a lot of concern about Chinese nuclear developments and modernization, expansion of the silos and this hypersonic glide vehicle. And to my mind, the most concerning piece of that is that China woke up, decided it wanted to compete with the United States at the nuclear level, because its estimation of the risk of conventional conflict with the United States in the past several years has gone way up. And it needs to stalemate the US at the nuclear level to open up space for conventional aggression. And that is actually a pretty terrifying prospect. It's not that the risk of nuclear exchange, suddenly skyrockets. It does a little bit, but the real take home is China is preparing to fight an offensive and aggressive conventional war, and improving its nuclear position with the United States is a huge piece of that, so it can avoid US nuclear coercion and potentially nuclear escalation in a theater conflict. And if that is an indicator of Beijing's estimation for the risk of conventional conflict, it could be it thinks the conflict is coming to it. It could also be that it's going to start the conflict. And that I think is sort of the most terrifying prospect. And I think that has huge implications for India-China relations, and not just the United States. So there was that nuclear question, so I couldn't help but just divert a little bit into that. Kanti, you get the last word.
Okay, just on the nuclear, I mean, I think at the moment, the Americans have escalation dominance, whatever that means. But I mean, I think the Chinese are aware of it. So your point is correct, that if you want to get out of that problem of escalation dominance, being with the Americans, you've got to level up on the nuclear as much as you can.
Absolutely.
And by the way, India's in a problem there with the Chinese, because we've argued we have escalation dominance against the Pakistanis, but the Chinese have it vis-a-vis us. So there's a problem for us there. And the Agni 5 today, the test, is a move towards leveling up there as well. But just on the quick one, I mean, I don't think we'll bandwagon with China, but I think you could say from 1988 onwards, when Rajiv Gandhi, in a sense, accepted the Chinese argument that we should have a balanced, normalized relationship, don't hang everything on a border settlement and China pulling away from the parts of territory that we claim and so on. That was already a concession to a Chinese view, one China policy, which has a long history, and that wasn't from 1988, but a general sense that India would do something that the Chinese did, which is what the question said, which is the Chinese do a China on China. The Chinese exploited the Americans economically and so on and so forth to become powerful. And I think there has been a feeling in India that until things blew up in about 2013 or 14, that we could do a China on China, access its markets, its investments, perhaps some of its technology, et cetera, a certain amount of strategic hiding, not getting up onto China's radar screen too much and so on and so forth. I mean, that would be quite a way to go. But by about 06, 07, that was beginning to no longer be a very attractive possibility or a feasible one. For various reasons, including the Chinese attitude towards India at that point. And on the third point that I wanted to make was the one on, somebody asked about, I've lost it. I shouldn't have gone down the road of trying to talk about nuclear missiles. There's something I wanted to say. Oh yeah, no, it was about Apeksha's problem on backsliding. So I think I agree that, I mean, the Chinese may not care about, autocracy and democracy and all of that, but like the Russians, they may see an opportunity. I mean, when you're getting backsliding with extremist groups operating in these two countries, I mean, the Russians have certainly exploited the rise of right-wing extremism in the United States, white extremism and backsliding to advantage. I'm not sure how much the Chinese have already, but it's a tempting possibility for them as well. And I wonder if there's that thought also a possibility with India, that as India's, if there's a churn in India over its democracy increasingly, whether the Chinese think that gray zone tactics and so on can be used in India as well to make the churn even worse, the instability sharpen. So, I mean, I think that's a worry about the democratic backsliding, autocracy, and perhaps a kind of political churn that is occurring in both these two big democracies.
That's an important point. That's where democracies are particularly vulnerable also, right? Well, we've reached the end, and we had many more questions we could have asked, but I really, really want to thank this all-star panel. Diplomats I've admired, a professor who inspired me to go into this field. So that for me, this was a real treat to be able to be part of this. And I thank you guys all very much for doing it. At our peak, I think we had about 130 participants, although I'm not sure how many were bots calling in. I was a little concerned at one point, but we had quite a few.
135.
Yeah.
At our peak, 135.
135. We'll assume those are all legitimate participants. So, and not trying to split our democracy in half. It's everybody should buy each of these books. And continuing with this theme, we have an event with Ambassador Nirupama Rao with her new book, which has just come out in, I believe, February as part of this series. And we're very excited to host her for that event. But please virtually join me in thanking Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, Ambassador Shivshankar Menon, and Professor Kanti Bajpai for a tremendous panel. This has been a lot of fun, a little depressing. And I think, India has its work cut out for it. The United States has its work cut out for it. There are a lot of areas of convergences between our two countries. But there's no question that, to borrow the Department of Defense's terminology and jargon, China is the pacing threat, I think, for both countries. And so please join me in thanking them. I wish everybody a good night in India and Singapore. And we will see all of you at our next event then.